Hello again. Once again, my name is Charlie, and I'm here to walk through the last in our series of Power BI guided projects. This is the Dataquest guided project, Building a BI App. So we're going to do that. Once again, a few little notes up front. In the Dataquest interface, you can actually interact with Power BI directly, and you can do the entire project right in there. In fact, that's probably the way that I'd recommend doing it. However, you can also do it in Power BI Desktop, which is what I've got going on right over here. And I'm going to be doing it in Power BI Desktop because that's going to just make it bigger and clearer and easier for you to actually see what's going on in this report. So just be aware of that, but you can do it in the Dataquest interface as well. So yeah, this is the interactive session is loading over here. Eventually this will time out because I'm not going to interact with it. But the first thing that we need to do is check out the data that we have and load it into Power BI. So if you are using Power BI Desktop and you need to grab that data for yourself, the three files are here, and you'll see if you click on them, you can click this little download button right there. And so you're going to need to download all three of these CSV files. I have already done that, so I'm not going to do that right now. I already have them saved in a folder, but that is something that you will need to do if you don't have them already. So get those downloaded. And we want to just take a look at what's going on in the data. So the data in this project is from Dataquest. It's about course completions and how many people are starting a lesson versus finishing it, that kind of stuff. So specifically, we've got these three tables. We've got data about mission progress. And as you probably know, a mission in Dataquest is sort of like a little a lesson within a course. And so that includes some information like IDs about the user and the lesson, when they started it, what's the lesson they were doing, did they complete it, yes or no, or true or false in this case, what time did they complete it. Then we've got some NPS survey data, like that gets sent to Dataquest users via email, I think, and it's a 0 through 10 score. Would you recommend this or not? So this is some sort of customer feedback data, you could call it. And then we also have a table of course IDs and lesson IDs so that we can sort of connect each lesson to the bigger course that it falls into. So we are going to grab all of these and bring them into Power BI. So let's go get data from another source because they are CSV files. And I'll note also as I'm loading these in that I will probably do a little bit of fast forwarding of the final video just so that you don't have to sit there. Okay, so the first one is loaded in. Let's bring in some more. And so again, we got to do get data text CSV, lesson progress, and I'm just going to fast forward again here. Okay, so we now have all of our data loaded into our project. So now that it's loaded in, that's all we needed to do for this step. I'm just going to slide this over to make it smaller so we can see as much of the Dataquest screen as possible. All right, so we're on to step 3. And so we need to build the data model to connect lesson ID across these three tables. So there are a couple things we need to do. And the first thing we need to do is change the lesson ID and course ID fields to text. So let's hop in here. And we're going to click home on this top ribbon, transform data. And we need to do this across all three tables. So we're going to change these to text. Yes. Oh, whoops, I don't want to change that to text. Lesson ID is the one I want to change to text. Okay. So we should be all set there, and we will hit close and apply. And now is as good a time as any to also remember that we do need to save. So I'll wait for this to finish applying. And then we'll just save this as final proj, sure. Okay, so we have done that. And then the next thing that we're tasked with is creating the relationships between lesson ID in course lesson and lesson ID in the other two tables. So this is sort of like I mean, essentially it is the same thing as a foreign key relationship in SQL, if you're familiar with that. So what we're going to be doing here is, so I'm now over here in the model view, and I'm actually going to just slide course lessons right into the middle there, so it's a little bit easier. And then we're going to hit manage relationships, and we're going to add a couple of new relationships. So the first one is going to come from course lessons lesson ID column, and we're going to tie that to the lesson progress lesson ID column, which makes sense. And this is a one-to-many relationship in the sense that there's one lesson ID in course lessons. That lesson ID could appear many times in lesson progress because lots of folks have started the same lesson. So let's get that going, and we need to create another one. We're essentially doing the exact same thing, but now it's for, whoops, the lesson ID, column in course lessons and the lesson ID column in the NPS data. So we will close that, and now we can see we have this one-to-many relationship here and a one-to-many relationship here. And so we've got our data model set up, and we can move on to the next step. Okay, so this one, there is a lot of stuff going on. This is where we're going to start digging into lesson completion rate, and we're going to create a whole visualizer page to take a look at that. So let's just look at all of the instructions that we kind of need to do, because we're going to need to do a bunch of things to be able to make this work. So we want to create a KPI visual that shows the completion rate across lessons, and that's going to require creating a month-year column and also a completion rate measure. So those are two things that we're going to need to go and create, and we're going to need to use the count rows function to do that. And then we're going to add another KPI visual that's going to show lesson completion. So that's going to mean adding another measure, the lesson completions measure. And then we're going to build a line chart of completion rate by month. We're going to make a scatter chart, and then we're going to add a slicer with course ID so that we can see all of this information for a specific course if we want to. So let's, I know that's a lot, but we're going to go through it step by step here. So the first step is to go into our data view and open up lesson progress, because there's some things that we're going to need to create here. So the first thing we need to do is create that measure, the completion rate measure. And so we're going to that, new measure. And I'm going to be copying and pasting the formulas for this video because there's a lot of typing and you don't need to watch me doing it. And also because I've got a microphone right in front of my face. It's difficult to type on the keyboard, and I don't want to do this much typing. But so basically what we're doing here is we're creating the measure completion rate, and we're going to count the rows looking at the number of lessons where the lesson progress is, where the lesson was completed, where is complete is true. And then we're going to divide that by the total number of lessons. And so that's going to give us a rate, right? It's the number of lessons completed over the number of lessons, period. So we'll hit enter to create our measure there. And our measure has been created. We can see it right over here. And so now we're going to need to add a new column for month year. So we're going to just do this again. And instead of choosing new measure, we're going to choose new column. And so once again, we're going to use a formula for that. Basically, what we're doing here is using the built-in date function. We're just grabbing the year and the month from the started at column, which is a date time column in this table. And we've got our month year column. So that is lovely. So we also need to add a lesson completions measure. That's going to count the number of times a lesson is completed. So let's just add another new measure here. And here is lesson completion. So this one is even more straightforward. We are just counting the number of rows in lesson progress where complete equals true, the number of rows that indicate that the lesson was actually completed. So let's create that measure. Okay, and we're going to add one more called lesson starts because I'm pretty sure that we need that as well. So that is a new measure again. And that's just a count of the rows in lesson progress. Okay, so I think we have all of the measures in the new column that we need. If we don't, we're going to find out soon when we try to do the visualization here. But let's jump in and we'll work on our first page of the visualization. So we need to create a bunch of things. We need to create a couple of KPI visualizations, and then we're doing a line chart and a scatter plot, and then a slicer with course ID so we can filter all of that data by the specific course that we're looking at. So let's dive into that. So first we'll create a KPI. And this first one is going to be the completion rate by month a year. So we're going to drag completion rate to the value, month a year to the trend axis. And there we go. We've got our completion rate by month and year. And let's add another KPI. And this one is lesson completions by month year. So we need to do lesson completions as the value. Again, month year is the trend axis. And there we go. So here we've got a nice overview of the completion rate each month, and then the raw number of lesson completions each month. That's pretty cool. Now we need to make a line chart, and that's going to show the completion rate month by month. So let's add a line chart. And the y-axis will be completion rate. The x-axis will be month year. And we can remove quarter and day because we don't care. And so now we've got a nice chart of month and year of the completion rate. That's pretty cool. Whoops. Slide back. I just like having things lined up. So, okay, there we go. We've got that. Now we need to add a scatter plot. So, this is a scatter plot. What is this? Let's look at Dataquest again and get the directions again. A scatter plot that shows the number of lessons started on the x-axis and completion rate on the y-axis. Okay, so yes. So we need x-axis is going to be that lesson starts measure that we created. The y-axis is going to be the completion rate. And then the values is going to be course ID. And so there we can see we've got what we're looking for, but this is being massively thrown off by this one outlier that we have here. So this is accurate, but if we wanted to make this a little bit more readable, which we probably do, we can go over to format your visual, and then we can do, there's a bunch of different things that we could do. So we could switch it to like a log scale. It doesn't really help in this case. Or we could just say, you know what, we're going to throw away this outlier. I'm going to assume that that's not super meaningful. And let's set this to a maximum of maybe 100,000 or something. Oh, I'm looking at the y-axis instead of the x-axis. I do this every time. My goodness. So yeah, we could switch it to a log scale. There we get a little bit more useful information there. Or if that's going to be confusing, we could set this to a maximum of like 100,000. We're getting most of our data in there. So this is really, it's up to you and who your audience is, whether using, log scale is going to give you probably the best way to see all of the data, but is your audience going to notice that and kind of be able to interpret that data correctly? Maybe not. So that's really up to you as far as how you want to mess with the visualization of this. But those are a couple different options that you have. Anyway, let's move on. And so the last task for this screen is going to be to add a slicer. and slice by course ID. So now we can see like the completion rate for a specific course. So we could see the course ID 100 has a lower completion rate than average. Not a lot of lesson completions every month. 110 is a lot closer to the average. So yeah, so now we've got this nice slicer. If we wanted to look at a specific course, we could do that. And not all the courses have data. There are quite a lot in there. So yeah, we have essentially finished that screen. So let's move on to the next one. There is an optional challenge on this screen of creating a histogram of completion rate. And I will leave that to you to take on that challenge if you would like to. And I also should highlight, here's the hint. I think because the first time I was going through this, I was definitely looking at the hints. It is useful sometimes to get some help. And if you're using Dataquest and you're at this project, you probably already know this, but if not, you can get help. You can get a hint. Seeing the answer doesn't really work in these guided projects. You'll just get that pretty much every time. But you can also dive into the community, and there are tons of people there who are ready and waiting to help you. So if you do get stuck anywhere along the line here, you decide to take on this optional challenge, or you decide to try some of the next steps that we'll talk about at the end, and something goes wrong, you can get help, which is great. All right, so let's move on to step 5 or screen 5. And for this, we're going to be looking at NPS. And it's useful to know how NPS works, basically, and that's what this is going to walk us through, but I'm just going to summarize it. So a user of a product, so in this case, a Dataquest learner, gets sent an email saying, hey, how likely are you to recommend this to a friend or somebody that you know, anybody, 0 through 10. And so then it further gets broken down into these categories of detractors, passives, and promoters. So that's what we're going to be analyzing here. And we're going to create a new page for NPS. We're going to add some KPI visuals for that. We're going to build a line chart of NPS score by month. We're going to make a scatter plot. We're going to make a histogram of the survey score responses. We're going to add another slicer just like we did on the last one, so you can slice all of it by course ID. So let's dive in. We can create another page right now, but let's go to the data view, because to do this, we're going to need to create a bunch of new things first. So I'm going to close that down just so it's a little easier to see what we're focused on here. We're going to go to NPS data. And so the first thing we're going to do is create a new column. And this is a month-year column, just like the one that we created in the last table, except that obviously now we're pulling it from the date column that's here in this NPS table. So we're pulling the year and the month from this date column. But other than that, as you can see, the formulas, it's the same formula that we used essentially in the last one. We just changed what column we were pulling it from because it's a different table. So now, technically, there are other ways to do this, but what I'm going to do now is add 3 more columns to identify specific responses as a promoter, a detractor, or a passive, which is like the in-between. So promoter is I would recommend, detractor is I would not recommend, I would say bad things, and passive is meh. But those are defined by specific scores, right? So let's add some columns. We'll start with promoter. We're using an if function here. And so we're basically saying if the score that exists in a given row is greater than or equal to 9, then the value for promoter would be 1, meaning yes, this person is a promoter. If not, then the value for promoter is going to be 0, meaning this person or this row, this response is not a promoter. So we're going to add that, and we can see these are, we're seeing a bunch of 10 rows here at the top, and we can see that those have all been given a 1 in the promoter column. So we're going to do the exact same thing, except change up those numbers for passives and detractors. So passive is 7 or 8, and other than that, this is basically the same formula. If the score is 7 or 8, yes. If not, no. So again, here we can see these are all zeros in the passive column because these people responded with a 10. That makes them a promoter, not passive. And so now we'll add our detractor column, and those should all be zeros as well. At least for these rows that we can see. So detractor. And so this is any score that's 6 or less. If it's 6 or less, yes. If not, no. Whoops, I did not mean to do that. Okay, there we go. And so again, we can see these responses are 10s, so we're getting a 0 in the detractor column. But this will enable us to kind of easily identify which rows are promoters, passive, or detractors, which I think is useful to have, and I'm actually going to use it in some of the measure formulas. If you don't want to do that, there are other ways to do this, but I think this is the easiest way to do it. And if you were going to do more digging into the data, it would be helpful to have these columns anyway. So we're just going to do that. All right, so now we need to add another new measure. And this is going to be for NPS. And so what this is the response that a company gets from a single NPS survey is 0 through 10, right? That's what the user inputs. But the NPS score is usually reflected out of 100, and it is it's this formula right here, right? So it's the sum of, it's all the promoters minus all the detractors over the total number of rows, and then times 100 to make it a percentage. So as is probably obvious from the formula, the idea of this metric is the closer you are to 100, the closer you are to having everyone who has responded to your NPS survey say, yeah, I like this. I would recommend it to friends. Anyway, so we'll hit enter on that. We'll get that input. And so now we've got our NPS measure. And so it's just important to remember as we look at this analysis later that the scores users give are 1 through 10, but NPS is going to be 0 through 100. This is sort of like, these are the scores the users give, but this is the overall kind of score for the company. So it's a little different, just important to keep in mind. And I want to also add a measure for responses. That's another thing that's quite easy to do, and there would be other ways to do this, but I'm just going to toss a measure in there. I think that'll make it easy. So, and this is just counting the number of rows. Very straightforward, because we're going to need to use that for some of our stuff that we're doing now. So let's jump into we've got our first page here. And actually we could rename this, completion. And then our second page is going to be all about NPS. So we can call that NPS, but let's jump to our NPS page here. And we will now make more visualizations. So let's start with another KPI. And let's close that. I'll close these down so we can sort of see. So this KPI, the value is going to be NPS, and the trend axis is month year. And so now we can see the NPS score. We've got the trend sort of here in the background, and we can see that the NPS score 62.78. Pretty good. Pretty good. We've asked to add another KPI here for the number of responses. So we're just going to put the value as responses. Again, the trend axis is our month year. And so that's what we're looking at for responses each month or year, which again, not too bad. Hard to get people to interact, especially via email. So obviously a lot more people are taking courses than that, but that's the number of responses that we're getting, which is interesting. All right, let's look at this in a line chart format. So we are asked to add a line chart. We will do that. I'm just going to preemptively kind of make it a little bigger here. And so the Y value here is going to be NPS score, and the X is going to be month year. or excuse me, not the NPS score, but the NPS value or the NPS measure that we just created. So this isn't showing us the scores that users gave, but it is showing us the NPS score of like the company itself, that measure we just made. So we can see how it's moving around. We can see big drop in October, and then looks like some data is missing in there, and we can sort of track the NPS score over time. And not a huge, I mean, there's some, I don't know what's going on here or here. This looks like probably a data issue, but generally we can see Dataquest's NPS score has remained relatively steady. It's going to fluctuate up and down a little bit, but that's life. All right, so now the next thing we need to do is create a scatter plot. And so this is also going to be looking at NPS. So the y-axis, again, is going to be that NPS that we created. The x-axis is going to be response ID. But we're going to set it to count because we want to count the number of responses, and then values course ID. And so this is very similar to the scatter plot that we created in our completion thing. And again, we have everything kind of scrunched up because of a few outliers. So here, again, we can go over to our visual and we can decide what we want to do. So I think in this case, the Dataquest instructions specifically say to set it to log scale. So let's set it to a log scale. But in a real project, you would have to kind of think about, who is my audience? Are they familiar with a log scale? Are they going to recognize that, like, this is 1, this is 10, this is 100? Obviously the numbers are there, but depending on the audience, you still might not want to trust that they're going to be able to sort of read this chart accurately. So anyway, for now, we're doing what we're meant to be doing. We're also asked to create a histogram, which it's just going to give us the distribution of the data, but it's really just a bar chart. So we will add a bar chart here. And the x-axis is going to be the score. And then the y-axis is going to be the count of response ID again. It's already set to count this time. And so this is showing us the distribution of the scores that we got, right? Most of the scores that are in the data set are 10s. 9s and 8s are also pretty common. And then it goes down from there. And then there is a little jump with 0s, as you would expect, because that's just sort of how NPS scores work. But it looks like the distribution of our data tends to be pretty high, which makes sense given the NPS, the company NPS that we're seeing here. So this is the distribution of the responses that Dataquest received. And then this is the company NPS score that's based on the sort of average of these responses, or not the average. It's more complicated than that. It's the promoters minus detractors over responses times 100 to make it a percentage. So that is everything that we need for this page, except we need to add a slicer. Whoops, I need to double click that. And again, this is just a course ID slicer so that we can look at a specific course if we want to and see how it's doing. People really love this course, the 2 people who've given responses. So yeah, this is we should be pretty familiar with slicers already at this point, but that's if you wanted to look at data for a specific course, you now have this to work with. So we have got our NPS page done. And if we bring Dataquest back, let's just check off. Okay, so we did the KPI of NPS score. We did the line chart. We did a scatter plot. We did the histogram. We added the slicer. Yeah, so we're all done with this page. So let's hop into the next one. And so this is where we're kind of asked to do a little more digging into the data and actually make a recommendation. So we're going to create a new page. We're going to add a text box with some recommendations based on the data and what we're seeing. We're going to add a table that kind of adds some context, and we're going to add a Q&A visual so that a user could actually, if they were looking at this report, they could actually type questions in there and see information about the data, which is kind of cool. So let's create a new visualization page. We can call this, we'll just call this rec. because I don't want to type a whole word. Okay, so we do need to add a text box with our recommendation. We don't have any specific recommendations yet, but specifically what we've been asked to recommend is, whoops, that's too big. What courses do we think Dataquest should work on based on this data? Whoops, hitting all the wrong keys here. So I'm going to put TK, 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 TK. This is sort of journalist shorthand for I'm going to fill this in later. So I'm going to leave that there for now, and we're going to move on to adding the table. So I keep trying to drag them. I don't know why. So we'll add our table here, and this is going to have a bunch of information. So we're going to put course ID. We're going to put lesson ID. We're going to put completion rate. We're going to put lesson starts. We're going to put lesson completions. We're going to put NPS. Where did it go? There it is, our NPS measure. We're going to put the responses, right? NPS responses. Okay, so these are the columns that I picked. You could put other things in here depending on what you think is useful, but the basic idea is to give people a table that they can work with to see some of the most important data about a specific course and lesson, which is like what percentage of people are completing it, how many people are starting it, how many raw completions does it have, and what kind of NPS score and responses is it getting, if any. And the raw numbers are important because like the completion rate for a particular course might be very low, right? Maybe we've got one that's only has a 1% completion rate, but like if only a few people have ever started that lesson, or lesson, excuse me, not course, because these are all one course, but it's multiple lessons. But if a specific lesson has a very low completion rate, but also very low lesson starts, that might not be a priority to fix. Even though the completion rate is low, not that many people are taking it in the first place. So there might be higher priority areas for us to put our effort into if what we're asked to do is identify what are some courses that it would make the most sense for Dataquest to work on improving. So let's add our Q&A box, which is pretty straightforward. We just double click there and Power BI does all the fancy work for us. Make it a little bigger here. And so then anyone who's looking at this report could actually type a question in here and hopefully get a useful response, which is pretty cool. So the other thing that we're tasked with doing on this page is to actually make recommendations. And I don't want to give, this is something, your recommendations are going to be different based on what you look at and what you see in the data and what you think is important. One way to look at it is to kind of look at, not all the courses and lessons have completion rate data. So that's why I sorted in descending order, because otherwise we'd end up down here in no man's land. But so one way to look at this is to kind of say, okay, what lessons have a really low completion rate, but still a good number of people starting them? And then what courses are those a part of? So just really quickly, some courses as kind of scrolling through here that jump out to me for at least worth digging a little further into the data before making some recommendations. 47. It's a lot of starts, almost no completions. Scrolling up here a little bit further, 36, again, a lot of starts, not that many completions. Some of these other ones, as we can see, it's a low completion rate, but not that many people are even starting it, so that those probably aren't good priorities. 90, again, good number of starts, low completion rate. 50. So that's one way to look at it. I'm not actually going to type recommendations out up here, but when you do the digging into the data, it is a good idea to actually go through that. You probably want to spend a little bit more time even digging through this, but I'm not going to do that now because this is just a project walkthrough. Now that you've got the data here, it's really more a question of what do you think are those most important metrics and how are you going to choose to identify what the highest priority courses are for improvement. So what I just did is some very, very simple looking at this table. You could do some much more in-depth analysis where you kind of combine each lesson into a course. And so you could actually get a course sort of version of your completion rate, and then do your analysis based on that. There's a lot of things that you could do. There's a lot of ways you could approach this, right? You could look at the NPS scores a little bit, which I added them to the table, but then I ignored them in my analysis. But that's another thing you could look at. What are some courses that a lot of people are starting, but not many people would recommend, or a lot of lessons that a lot of people are starting, but wouldn't recommend, and should those be improved first? Even if the completion rate is okay, if people aren't having a good experience, they're not going to recommend it. Maybe that's a good thing to recommend improving. So this is where you really get analytical and kind of bring your own opinion into it, which is fun. But for now, let's move on through this project to the final step, which is to publish to Power BI. And so this is the part where we move into the actual Power BI interface. So we're going to save the report, we're going to publish it, we're going to create a dashboard, we're going to make that mobile friendly, and then we'll create a Power BI app and set up the navigation in that app. So a Power BI, I do need to add a little note about this here. A Power BI app is Microsoft Power BI's sort of nomenclature for a collection of data that you can then share with anybody, and anybody can go in and interact with it and play with the data. So it's a really cool and really powerful thing. It is not available to free users of Power BI Desktop, which is what I have. So these two steps, I am not going to be able to complete in this video because I don't have Power BI Pro. However, I believe that you can complete them in the Dataquest interface if you're doing that. And certainly if you have Power BI Pro, you can complete them there. And that may be a worthwhile investment for you to make if you're working as a data analyst. Certainly, if you aspire to be a data analyst, that is, as you know, Power BI is a very valuable tool. So that might be something to invest in. But for our purposes here, I'm not going to be able to complete these two steps because I don't have Power BI Pro, but we will do the rest of it. And I'll talk about how you could do this. So for now, the first step would be to sign into your Power BI account. I'm actually already signed in. You can see my name up there. So I'm going to save my project again, which I probably should have done earlier in the program here. And then I'm just going to hit publish right there. And I'm going to publish it to my workspace. And that'll spend a few seconds. Okay, so it is published. And you can jump right into it just by clicking that. And so now I'll drag this back over. It's opened up in this window. Signing into the Power BI interface. And so here we can see we've got all of our reports. So the first thing that we were tasked to do is to create to pin a bunch of these metrics to a dashboard. So let's pin these KPIs. And I'm going to create a new so I already went through this project once, so that's why that's there. But I'm going to create a new dashboard because that's what we're meant to do. Dataquest quality control dashboard. So we'll pin it to that. Great. Sure, I was trying to get. There we go. So we're just pinning a bunch of these metrics to, and those we don't need to pin. Okay, so now let's go to create mobile layout because we were asked to create a mobile layout of our dashboard. And so now we have this here, and this works fine, but this is where we could adjust if we wanted to, and kind of, maybe we want to bring this up here. We can make this one that same size, and then we can put these sort of right next to each other. And so now we've got this nice little thing, and we can do the same thing here. Whoa, whoops, that's not what I meant to do. There we go. Trying to bring this up here. There we go. So now we've got this nice little dashboard that's all set up. So obviously this is kind of a personal taste thing, how you want it to look, but this is one approach to doing that. And of course you could pin other things in here as well if you wanted to add them to this dashboard. So there we go. We've got our mobile thing set up. And so the next step here would be to create an app. As I said earlier, I don't have Power BI Pro, so I can't actually create an app, but basically you would do that from this area to create a new app. And then all you're tasked with doing once you've actually created the app is to set the navigation so the dashboard comes first, followed by the report. So you're just going to be making sure that in the app, what people see first is this dashboard that we just created, and then the report itself. Pretty straightforward. And if we jump on to the last screen of the project, we can see we're all done. We have gone through a whole analysis. We've made recommendations. We published our data to Power BI, and we published it as an app for those of us who were able to do that. If you have Power BI Pro or you're doing it within Dataquest. So obviously that is still just the tip of the iceberg, and there's a ton more that you can do. There are some challenge suggestions here if you want to dig into some of these. You can also, of course, go over to the community and see what other people have done with their guided projects. If I jump back into mine for a minute, one thing that jumps out pretty immediately is the titles and legends, and all of this stuff is kind of ugly. It's also not the most exciting color scheme ever. There's a lot more interesting we could do there. All of this analysis is also by lesson. So one of the things that I think I would want to do as a next step is break this down more by specific courses rather than lessons, and say, okay, what is the sort of average NPS over an entire course, and what courses have the highest and lowest NPS averages? What is the average completion rate over an entire course, and what courses have the highest and lowest completion rates? So that would be a cool next step. But as with any Dataquest project, there's really kind of the sky's the limit here, right? You can take this as deep as you want to go, and there is a lot of data here to work with, including some things that we didn't even really touch. Anyway, that seems like as good a place as any to wrap it up. So thank you for joining me again for yet another Dataquest Power BI guided project. If you finish this one, I believe you have finished the entire path, the Dataquest Data Analyst in Power BI career path. So congratulations and best of luck on your career journey.